Clayton Rourke hadn't been back to the Rimrock Valley in over 6 years. Folks who knew him once would say he left with more ghosts than a man should carry, and that was about right. He didn't say much on the trail these days, not even to his horse. His eyes stayed low, his thoughts quieter than the wind running over the plains. He'd grown rougher around the edges, like a boot worn to the shape of sorrow. Most days, he drifted from ranch to ranch, trading labor for a place to sleep, always keeping his name to himself and his past buried like a body no one was ever supposed to find. He told himself he only came back to buy a horse. That was it. Simple trade. Rancher outside Laurel Hill claimed he had a blood bay mare fit for endurance and speed. Clayton figured he could use her for the kind of work that didn't ask too many questions. But truth be told, it wasn't just the horse. It was the pull. The kind of pull that drags a man back to where the worst part of his life had happened, where a part of him still lay, broken and breathing just under the dirt. 10 years ago, his little girl vanished from their homestead in broad daylight. Evelyn was 6. One moment she was in the garden picking wild onions with her mother, and the next gone. No signs, no screams, no blood, just the scattered onions, her favorite doll lying face down in the grass, and a silence so sharp it cut every inch of peace from the Rourke house. His wife, Helen, had never recovered. Grief made her bones brittle and her mind worse. 2 winters later, she wandered into the woods barefoot in the snow. They found her body under a pine tree, frozen stiff, hands curled like she was still reaching for something. Clayton hadn't spoken her name out loud since. The road into Laurel Hill hadn't changed. Dry, rutted, and flanked by dying grass that crackled beneath the hooves of his horse. A few wagons passed, but none stopped. No one waved. This wasn't the kind of town that trusted strangers, even ones that used to live here. Especially not ones like him. A man who had the look of someone who'd buried too much. The McClendon Ranch sat a few miles out, framed by a crooked fence and a windmill that spun lazily against the sky. Clay had never met Paul McClendon, but he'd heard the man kept a tight grip on his livestock and an even tighter one on his secrets. He didn't think much of it. Most ranchers had things they didn't want the law poking into. That was life out here. You lost things, you hid things, and sometimes you pretended you never had them in the first place. Paul met him in the barn, big man with a dull red beard and hands that looked like they could crush granite. His eyes didn't smile when his mouth did, and that was the first sign. Not a man to trust. Still, Clayton shook his hand and followed him through the stalls. "She's in the last pen," Paul said, nodding toward the back. "Good legs. Strong shoulders. Don't spook easy." Clayton walked slow, eyeing the shadows between the slats. Something in the air felt off. The kind of off you can't see, but you feel in the pit of your stomach, like something dead left too long in the sun. The other horses seemed skittish, heads jerking, hooves shifting. His boots clicked against the boards, echoing too loud in the stillness. Then he heard it. Not a horse. Not an animal at all. It was a rustle. Faint, like straw being shifted by something small. Then breathing. Shallow, ragged, human breathing. He stopped cold, heart beating like it had caught fire. "What's in that stall?" he asked. Paul didn't answer right away. "Tack room's back there," he said too quick, motioning with a thumb. But Clayton wasn't buying it. He stepped past the man before he could say more, and what he saw made his stomach turn inside out. In the back stall, behind a broken gate tied, shut with rope, lay a shape half covered in straw. Bare legs, thin arms. A girl, maybe 13 or 14, curled up like she hadn't moved in hours. Her hair was tangled, matted with dirt. Wristbound, duct tape across her mouth. Paul shouted something, but Clayton didn't hear it. He was already moving, already pulling at the rope, tearing it with hands that suddenly remembered how to be a father, how to save something. The girl flinched when he touched her, eyes wide, wild with fear. But she didn't scream. She just stared at him with something too familiar. Clayton yanked the tape from her mouth. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe. I got you." Then she said something that cracked him clean in two. "Daddy." He couldn't breathe. couldn't move, because the voice was hers. Evelyn's. 10 years gone. 10 years buried in guilt and nightmares and prayers that never found a place to land. And there she was, thin as a fence rail, shaking but alive. Clayton didn't have time to process it. Paul was already behind him, shouting, grabbing. Clayton turned and swung, fist landing hard against the man's jaw. The rancher stumbled back, but not down. "I don't know who the hell you think she is," Paul snarled, wiping blood from his mouth. "But that girl's mine." "No, she ain't," Clayton said, voice low, dangerous. "She's mine, and you're gonna pay for what you've done." Paul reached for something, maybe a knife, maybe a gun, but Clayton didn't wait to find out. He picked Evelyn up, light as she was, and ran. Through the barn, past the corrals, to his horse. She didn't speak again, just held on, face buried in his coat, trembling like a leaf in the wind. The road back to town stretched longer than he remembered. Every hoofbeat felt like it might be the last before Paul caught up. But they made it. Sheriff Taggart still wore the same hat, same badge, same tired look. Clayton rode straight to the jailhouse, Evelyn in his arms, and when Taggart stepped outside, he didn't even ask questions. Just looked at the girl, then at Clayton, and nodded once. "Let's get her safe first," the sheriff said. Clayton didn't sleep that night. Sat outside the doctor's office on a bench with his head in his hands. His girl was alive, but she hadn't been living. She'd been locked away, hidden, raised like livestock by a man who didn't see her as a person. And Clayton had to ask himself, had he given up too easy? Had he buried his daughter before the grave was even dug? That guilt, that sharp hook, dug deeper than any wound he'd ever had. And somewhere, buried in the silence, he knew this wasn't over. Because if Paul McClendon had taken her, he hadn't done it alone. And in a town like Laurel Hill, where silence was bought and paid for, someone else knew. Someone let happen. And Clayton wasn't leaving until he found out who. Sheriff Taggart stood with his arms crossed outside the clinic, his jaw tight. The man had always looked like he carried the whole county's problems in the lines of his forehead. He and Clayton had once been close, years back, before life cracked them in different ways. Taggart had been the one to help search for Evelyn back when she first went missing. He'd been the one to stand over Helen's frozen body and say nothing because there was nothing worth saying. He didn't talk much now either, but when he looked at Clayton, something passed between them that didn't need words. It was shared regret, a kind of quiet understanding that both of them had failed that little girl. Inside, Evelyn slept under clean sheets for the first time in God knows how long. The doc, an older woman named Esther Mays, said she was dehydrated, malnourished, and bruised all over, but no broken bones. No visible signs of, well, the kind of damage a man might expect after 10 years of captivity. That was something, at least. But the doctor warned that physical healing was only half of it. What the girl had lived through, what she'd seen, what she'd learned to do to survive, that wouldn't leave her easily. Clayton sat outside her room, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the floor. Every time he blinked, he saw her as a little girl again, running barefoot through the pasture, laughing with flowers in her hand. And now, this teenager with hollow cheeks and a haunted stare. She barely spoke a word since they got to town, just held onto his arm like she didn't believe he was real. Taggart finally spoke. "You sure it's her?" Clayton nodded slowly. She knew things. Her mother's song, a scar under her chin from when she fell off the porch. "It's her." "Well," Taggart said, sighing, "that opens up a world of trouble. McClendon's claiming you stole his adopted daughter. He's got some kind of papers to back it up." Clayton's hands curled into fists. "He bought her, Taggart. You know damn well that ain't adoption." "I know," Taggart said, "but proving it's going to be hell. He's got friends on the county board, judges who owe him favors. Then I'll drag the truth out of him myself. You do that, and you'll end up in a cell right next to him. You want your girl back for good? We do this right. Slow, smart." Clayton didn't like it, but he knew the sheriff wasn't wrong, and he wasn't alone anymore. Not entirely. Word spread fast in Laurel Hill. By the next day, Folks were already whispering. Some are old neighbors, too scared or too proud to say much. But a few people came forward, quietly, cautiously. There was Clara Finch, who ran the dry goods store. She used to bring bread to Helen when she stopped eating. Clara looked at Evelyn through the clinic window and broke down sobbing. "I knew that child wasn't dead," she said, her voice shaking. "I knew it." Then came Thomas Crane, a wiry ranch hand who used to work for McClendon. He showed up late one evening at the jailhouse, smelling like tobacco and fear. Said he saw something years ago, a little girl in the back of the barn, tied up. Paul told him she was troubled, said she'd been abandoned, and he was taking care of her. Thomas had believed him, mostly because he didn't want to believe otherwise. "I quit the next spring," Thomas said, eyes darting. "Couldn't sleep right. Couldn't look that man in the eye no more." Clayton stared at him, jaw tight. "Why didn't you come forward?" Thomas shrugged helplessly. "'Cause I like my kneecaps." And Paul don't forgive. The sheriff took his statement, but even he admitted it might not be enough. And that's when another name came up, Levi Jensen, a cattle broker who moved between counties. He was slick, clean-shaven, always wore gloves even in summer. Folks said he did business with McClendon, but no one knew what kind. Just that he always came back with more money than seemed right for just cattle. Clayton found Levi at the saloon, lounging with a whiskey in one hand and his boot propped on the edge of table. The man smiled too easily. Talked like he was always half a step ahead of everyone else. "You're the father," Levi said, not even trying to hide it. Word travels fast. Clayton didn't sit. "You do business with McClendon?" "Now and then," Levi said, sipping his drink. "Though I don't reckon I'll be making any more stops at his ranch. Bad for the reputation." Clayton stepped closer. "What was he selling you?" Levi smiled again, thinner this time. "Not horses. You ever see my daughter?" Levi's eyes flicked up, sharp now. "Not directly, but I saw the setup. Back room, locked from the outside. Heard crying once. Asked questions. McClendon told me I was better off not knowing." "You go to the law?" Levi raised a brow. "You think the law listens to me? Hell, I'm barely legal myself in half these counties." So Levi had known. So had Thomas. Probably others too. And none of them did a damn thing. That was the part Clayton couldn't shake. Not the evil that he understood. Evil was loud and ugly. But the silence around it, that's what killed people. That's what let Evelyn stay locked up for a decade. Not everyone was an enemy, though. There was Marin Holloway, the widow who ran the boarding house. She'd been sweet on Clayton once, long before Helen. And even after the tragedy, she never looked at him with pity, only sorrow. She offered him a room for free, said Evelyn could stay too when she was strong enough to leave the clinic. She even brought soup and blankets, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the corners of the bed. "She needs peace," Marin said quietly. "You do too." Clayton wanted to believe her, but peace felt like a myth now. And then there was Jonah Ellis. He showed up the third day, right after word came down that the county judge was refusing to issue a warrant for McClendon's arrest. Said there wasn't enough immediate threat. Jonah was Paul's cousin, or claimed to be, had the same cold blue eyes and the kind of smile that didn't reach his cheeks. Wore a suit that didn't fit and carried a badge from over in Pine Creek, a town no one trusted. "I'm here to help resolve the matter," Jonah said to Taggart, voice slick as oil. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Clayton watched him carefully. Everything about Jonah screamed bad news. And sure enough, that night, someone broke into Marin's house. Didn't steal anything. Just left a dead rabbit on the doorstep. Gutted, head twisted, blood still warm. Taggart said it was a message. Marin didn't say a word. Just quietly scrubbed the porch clean the next morning like it had never happened. Evelyn saw the blood, though. She froze up, hands shaking. Didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just froze. Clayton wrapped his arms around her and made a vow right there. He would not lose her again. But the deeper he dug, the more tangled things got. McClendon had friends. Money. A preacher who claimed the girl was gifted to them by God. A lawyer who had papers that looked real enough to convince half the courthouse she was legally theirs. A neighbor who swore they'd rescued her from a life of poverty and had only been protecting her. Even Taggart began to wonder if this could be won in a courtroom. "You want justice," the sheriff said one night. "You might have to go outside the lines." Clayton looked at him hard. "You telling me to take care of it myself?" "I'm saying," Taggart replied, "this town's built on quiet deals and quiet threats. If you're waiting on the law to fix what the law's afraid to touch, you'll be waiting another 10 years. And that's when Clayton realized this wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about the whole town. How many other girls? How many other secrets? He wasn't just up against one man. He was up against the lie that kept Laurel Hill running. And someone, maybe a lot of someones, were willing to kill to keep that lie alive. The days that followed were filled with small moments, quiet, tender, and strange, like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Evelyn stayed at Marin's, in a back room with lace curtains and a quilt that smelled like lavender. She barely spoke at first, just nodded when spoken to, eyes flitting to every shadow like danger might reach through the walls at any time. But bit by bit, she began to change. A sip of tea here, a faint smile when Marin's cat climbed onto her lap, a whispered word or two when Clayton tucked her in for the night, sitting on the edge of the bed like he used to when she was small. The first time she called him Daddy, without flinching, Clayton had to step out into the hallway so she wouldn't see the tears running down his face. He didn't know how to be a father to a girl who had grown up in a locked stall, who had survived things she hadn't yet said out loud. But he tried. He brushed her hair when she let him, even though it came out in tangled clumps. He bought her a book from the dry goods store, a worn copy of Black Beauty, and watched her trace the pages with her fingers like she was learning how to touch the world again. They went on short walks behind Marin's house, just far enough for her to see the hills, the horses, the wide sky. She never let go of his hand. Marin watched all of it quietly, her eyes always soft but never pitying. She was the kind of woman who knew how to hold broken things without trying to fix them. Her presence gave him space to breathe. At night, when Evelyn was asleep, she and Clayton would sit in the kitchen with coffee between them, talking low. "I never had children," Marin said once. "One of them. Lost 3 before they ever took a breath." Clayton nodded slowly. "I lost mine and didn't even know she was still breathing." "You didn't lose her," Marin said. "She was taken." "That's different." He wanted to believe that, but the guilt was never far. It followed him like a shadow. He kept thinking about the day Evelyn disappeared, how he'd gone into town for supplies, how Helen had begged him not to leave her alone. "Just an hour," he'd said. What could happen in an hour? Now he knew. Everything could happen in an hour. A whole life could get stolen in that space. Still, Evelyn was here now, and she was healing piece by piece. She even laughed once, a sharp, surprised sound that startled everyone in the room. It was Marin's cat again, pawing at a ball of yarn like a drunk. Evelyn laughed, then clamped her hand over her mouth like she'd done something wrong. "It's okay to laugh," Clayton told her gently. "I forgot what it felt like," she whispered. But not everything was good. Paul McClendon hadn't gone quiet. He'd hired a lawyer from Missoula, some stiff man in a gray suit who filed papers claiming Clayton was mentally unfit and Evelyn was in danger under his care. They tried to paint her as disturbed, unstable, prone to fantasy. Said she'd imagined her captivity and was confused about her memories. The whole thing was a lie, but it had teeth. And worse, the judge agreed to hear the case. "You're going to lose her again," Taggart said one night, pacing in the jailhouse. "Unless we find something solid, real proof, something that can't be spun or buried." So Clayton pushed harder. He went back to McClendon's ranch with Taggart and 2 deputies, this time with a court order. They found chains in the barn, a bucket, soiled bedding, scraps of fabric that looked like they belonged to a child. Enough to make your stomach turn, but not enough to prove who'd been kept there, or for how long. It wasn't until they checked the cellar that they found the dress. Small, faded blue, a tear in the collar, embroidered flowers on the hem, flowers Helen had stitched by hand the summer before Evelyn vanished. It was hers. Clayton knew it down to the buttons. But even that wasn't enough. The lawyer claimed McClendon had taken in multiple orphan girls over the years, and that not all of them stayed. He made it sound like charity. Clayton nearly punched him in the mouth right there in the courtroom. That night, Evelyn had a nightmare. Woke up screaming, eyes wide, fists clenched. Clayton rushed in and held her, whispering over and over, "You're safe, baby girl, I've got you." But she didn't calm down. Not right away. Her whole body trembled like it wanted to fly apart. And then she started talking in broken, gasping pieces. About the barn. About the dark. About the other girl. What other girl? Clayton asked, heart racing. Evelyn clutched his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. Her name was Josie, she whispered. She was younger than me. She was there, and then she wasn't. One night, she cried too loud. He took her out and never brought her back. Clayton felt sick. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" he asked. Her voice was barely audible. "I didn't know if she was real or just in my head. I was so alone." That name, Josie, was a thread, and Clayton pulled hard. He and Taggart searched the records, asked questions, dug up old missing persons reports. And they found one. Josephine Carter, age 7. Disappeared from a town 2 counties over. Never found. They brought her mother in to speak with Evelyn. It was a painful, gut-wrenching thing, watching one mother look at a stranger's child, searching her eyes for a sign. Evelyn remembered details. Josie's locket, her favorite song, her laugh. It was enough. Enough to convince the judge that Evelyn's memories were not the fantasies of a damaged child, but truth. McClendon was arrested. But even then, the victory was bitter. Because Josie was gone. Because Evelyn still couldn't sleep through the night. Because no justice would ever make up for what had been stolen from her. One afternoon, Clayton took Evelyn to the edge of town, to the place where the hills opened wide and the wind smelled like sage. She stood there quietly, watching the clouds. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. She nodded. "Mama used to bring me here. I brought her once too," he said softly. "Before we lost you." She cried the whole way up. Said she had a dream that something was going to happen. I told her dreams were just wind in the head. Evelyn reached out and took his hand. "I dreamed about you," she said. He looked at her, startled. "All those years," she went on, "I dreamed you'd come. I didn't know what year it was. Didn't even know if you were still alive. But I kept dreaming you were coming." He pulled her into his arms, his chest aching. "I'm so sorry, Evie. I should have found you sooner." She shook her head against his shirt. "You found me," she whispered. "That's enough." But he knew it wasn't. Not really. Because Evelyn still flinched when she heard footsteps behind her. Still panicked when a door closed too loud. She had years ahead of her. Hard years, full of therapy and trying to feel safe again. And Clayton? He wasn't sure he could ever stop blaming himself. But there was something else now. A kind of strength in her. A spark. She had survived. She had endured something unspeakable and still found her way back to laughter, to trust, to light. She was stronger than him in some ways. And he realized maybe she would be okay. Maybe they both would. But the fight wasn't over. Because Paul McClendon had money and lawyers and friends in high places. Because men like him didn't stay behind bars unless someone held the key tight. And because Clayton knew there were others. Girls still missing. Families still waiting. And so, even in their moments of peace, the stakes kept climbing. Because this wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about every girl who never made a home. And Clayton Rourke had found something he didn't know he still had. A reason to keep fighting. Clayton had thought McClendon's arrest would be the turning point. That after years of silence, of guilt and nightmares, the truth being brought into daylight would mean something. But the truth was heavier than he expected. And justice didn't come with handcuffs. It came with a long road full of shadows that didn't want to let go. The first blow came 3 days after the arraignment. McClendon posted bail. $25,000, paid in full before sunset. Clayton stood in the courthouse hallway, jaw clenched, fists white at his sides, as McClendon walked out with that same smug look he'd worn the day he came to buy a horse. Behind him trailed his attorney and a ranch hand who looked like he'd kill to keep his boss's secrets. McClendon didn't say a word to Clayton. He just adjusted his collar, looked him dead in the eye, and gave him the smallest of smiles, like the whole thing was a game, and he was still one move ahead. Clayton wanted to lunge at him, but Marin touched his arm. "That's what he wants," she whispered. "Don't give it to him." But it was hard. Too damn hard. Especially when Evelyn started to slip again. She stopped eating for a while. Just sat at the table, moving food around on her plate. She didn't talk much either. The light that had started to grow behind her eyes dimmed, like someone had pulled a curtain. Every knock at the door, every loud voice in the street, sent her running to her room. "He's out," she whispered once, curled up on the floor beside her bed. "He's out. He's coming back. He's not coming near you," Clayton promised. "I'll see to that." But he could see in her face that promises weren't enough. He tried everything. Kept a gun within reach at all times, hired a man to watch the house, even parked his truck halfway across the drive so no one could sneak up from behind. But Evelyn didn't sleep. And when she did, she dreamed of chains and fire and girls who never came back. The second blow came in the form of a letter, delivered by hand. No return address. Inside, a single photograph, grainy, black and white. A photo of Clayton and Evelyn on the porch, taken from a distance. A red X, marked on Evelyn's chest in crayon. Clayton took it to Taggart right away. The sheriff stared at it for a long time before sliding it into a drawer. "This is what men like him do," he muttered. "They don't just break your body. They break your peace, your sleep, your sense of safety. They want you looking over your shoulder." "He's threatening my daughter," Clayton growled. "I know. Well." Taggart leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temple. "We'll increase patrols. I'll get a restraining order filed first thing tomorrow." Tomorrow ain't good enough. I know that too. But there was only so much Taggart could do. He was one man, working with 3 deputies and a budget barely enough to keep fuel in their trucks. Meanwhile, McClendon had connections. Old ranch money. A cousin on the state council. His lawyers began filing motions. Motions to exclude Evelyn's testimony, to seal certain evidence, to discredit the witness who remembered Josie Carter. They called it hearsay. Said Evelyn's mind was fragile, her memory unreliable due to trauma. Clayton felt like he was drowning in quicksand. Every day was a new setback. Every day he saw Evelyn slipping a little further away, until the day she ran. It happened in the early hours. A storm had rolled in during the night, and the house creaked under the weight of wind and rain. Marin had checked in on Evelyn before bed, kissed her goodnight like she always did. But when Clayton went to wake her that morning, her bed was cold. No note, no sound, just the window cracked open and footprints in the muddy garden. Clayton shouted her name until his voice broke. He and Marin searched the yard, the barn, the hills, calling until the wind stole their voices. He called Taggart. He called the neighbors. He rode through every back road and fence line for miles, soaked to the skin, throat raw from shouting. Nothing. Hours passed. Then a day. By the second night, he was unraveling. What if he took her? He whispered to Marin, his eyes wild. What if he got to her? But Marin didn't panic. Not the way he did. She sat him down at the kitchen table, poured him hot coffee, and looked him square in the eyes. She left because she's scared, not because someone dragged her away. She's a girl, Marin. She's just a girl. She's a girl who survived 10 years of hell. Don't you dare pretend she's not strong enough to leave on her own. Clayton didn't sleep that night. He stayed in Evelyn's room, clutching her old blanket, waiting for the wind to bring her back. And at dawn she did. Clayton found her on the porch, soaked to the bone, mud caked to her feet. Her hands trembled. Her lips were cracked from cold. "I went to her grave," she said, her voice a whisper. "Whose?" "Josie's. I needed to see it." Clayton knelt in front of her, brushing wet hair from her face. "Why?" She was alone when she died, Evelyn said. And I'm still here. It didn't feel fair. Oh, baby, I left because I wanted to stop feeling weak. Like I'm always running. I wanted to prove I could go somewhere on my own and come back. You did, Clayton said, voice thick. And it was awful, she added, collapsing into his arms. But I did it. And he held her while she cried. But something shifted after that. Evelyn began to change. She stopped hiding. She sat through every court hearing that followed, staring McClendon in the face without flinching. She told her story in front of strangers with a voice that didn't shake. And as she spoke, Clayton realized something terrible and beautiful at once. Evelyn wasn't his little girl anymore. She was something else now, something forged. But just when he thought maybe the worst had passed, the final blow came. The defense called Helen Rourke, Clayton's late wife. Only it wasn't really her, of course. It was her journals. McClendon's lawyers had gotten their hands on Helen's old diaries, pages she'd written when Evelyn was a baby, entries full of pain and postpartum rage and sorrow no one had ever known about. Sometimes I think she hates me, one page read. She cries so much, and I feel like a monster for wanting to walk away. And another, Clayton doesn't see it, but I'm scared of her. Scared I'll hurt her someday. I don't sleep anymore. The defense used these to suggest Evelyn's early childhood was unstable, that her memories were shaped by fear from infancy, that maybe she hadn't been kidnapped at all. Maybe she'd run away. The courtroom went silent. Clayton felt like he'd been stabbed, because no one knew Helen had written those words. No one knew how hard it had been for her after Evelyn was born. She never told anyone, and now her darkest thoughts were being used to erase the horror their daughter had endured. He stood to his feet. The judge warned him to sit down. Clayton didn't move. She was taken, he said, voice breaking. You can twist her mama's words, drag her through the dirt, but it don't change what happened. Evelyn was stolen from us, and that man kept her like an animal for a decade. Mr. Rourke. She came back broken and bleeding and afraid of her own shadow. You don't get that way from being loved too little. The judge slammed his gavel, but the jury listened. And as Clayton sat back down, Evelyn reached across and took his hand. He's trying to bury me, she whispered. Clayton met her eyes. Then we'll dig each other out, he said. And that's what they did. Together. The courtroom was packed. Not a single seat left open. People stood in the aisles, lining the back wall, leaning against pillars. It was the final day of testimony, and Clayton could feel the pressure bearing down on his chest like the whole town had their breath caught in their throats. The air smelled like dust and sweat and tension that had nowhere else to go. He hadn't wanted to take the stand, not because he was scared, but because he wasn't sure he could hold it together. He had watched his daughter fall apart and slowly stitch herself back together again, thread by trembling thread. She had spoken her truth, bravely, bluntly, and now it was his turn to do the same. But this wasn't just about telling the court what happened. This was about standing face to face with the man who stole 10 years from his little girl and trying not to let hatred speak louder than grief. When the clerk called his name, Clayton rose slowly. His boots echoed as he walked to the witness stand, every step louder than it should have been. He felt the weight of 100 eyes, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some hollow. And McClendon's. Always McClendon's. Do you swear to tell the truth? The clerk asked. I do. He sat, palms flat on the edge of the stand, fingers twitching from nerves or rage or both. The prosecutor nodded at him. Can you tell us what you remember about the day your daughter disappeared? Clayton swallowed hard. It was late September, hotter than usual. I got to town to pick up feed. Evelyn was playing in the back paddock. My wife, Helen, was home. She told me later she just went inside for a minute. A single minute. When she came back out, Evelyn was gone. A silence settled. I searched every inch of our land. We all did. Friends, neighbors, even strangers. We combed the woods, the hills, the old mine shafts. Days turned into weeks. No sign, no ransom, no footprints, just nothing. He paused, staring down at his hands. We thought she was dead. The prosecutor nodded solemnly. And when did you see her again? Clayton's voice cracked. 10 years later, in a barn, tied up in straw, starving. Across the room, McClendon shifted slightly, like the memory made him uncomfortable. The prosecutor asked a few more questions, and Clayton answered them with as much control as he could muster. But then the defense stood up. McClendon's lead attorney was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of voice that sounded calm even when he was trying to gut you. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "your testimony is moving, but you've admitted you believe your daughter was dead for a decade. Isn't it possible that your grief clouded your judgment? That your need to believe in a villain blinded you to other explanations?" Clayton blinked slowly. "Other explanations? For instance, you said before your late wife suffered from depression." "Yes, and she wrote in her own hand that she was afraid of your daughter, that she feared harming her. Isn't it possible, Mr. Rourke, that she did harm her, that your daughter ran away?" Clayton's mouth went dry. He looked at the jury, then at Evelyn, who sat clutching her knees, knuckles white. "No," he said simply. "But how can you be sure?" Clayton leaned in. "Because I know the difference between fear and survival. I saw in my daughter's eyes when she came back. I saw the marks on her body. I saw what 10 years of captivity did to her. You don't make those up. You don't fake that kind of damage." The attorney opened his mouth to object, but Clayton kept going. "You wanted to blame my wife, a woman who took her own life when the guilt of losing Evelyn crushed her. But I won't, because Helen didn't take her. He did." He pointed directly at McClendon, whose face twitched just for a moment. "You can twist memories. You can spin doubt. But the truth's still the truth, no matter how many shadows you throw at it." The judge warned him to stay on topic, but Clayton had already said what needed saying. He stepped down from the stand with his chest lighter than it had felt in years. That night, Evelyn came to him in the barn. She found him brushing down one of the horses, sweat glistening on his back, even under the chill of night. "Is it true," she asked softly, "what they said about Mom?" Clayton set down the brush, exhaled slowly. "Yeah." She struggled. "A lot more than I knew at the time." "Did she hate me?" He shook his head. "No. She hated herself. For not being enough. For not being the mother she thought you deserved. But she loved you, Evie. Even on her worst days, she loved you more than anything." Evelyn nodded, eyes glassy. "I hated her for a while," she whispered. "When I was with him, I blamed her for not stopping it. I thought, maybe she gave me away." Clayton's heart broke in half. "You were just a kid. You were hurt. No one blames you for what you felt." "I blame me," she said, voice cracking. Clayton crossed the space between them and pulled her into a hug. "You can carry that weight, or you can lay it down. But either way, I'm not letting you do it alone." She sobbed into his shirt, fists clutched against his chest. It was the first time she had let herself fall apart in his arms, and the first time he'd been strong enough to hold her through it. A week later, the trial neared its end. The closing arguments were brutal. The prosecution laid out every piece of evidence: Evelyn's story, the chain of events, the physical signs of abuse, the pattern of similar disappearances tied to McClendon's land. The defense tried to chip away at all of it, casting doubt where they could, leaning hard on Helen's journals and Evelyn's unreliable memory. But the jury saw through it. On the third day of deliberation, they came back. Clayton held Evelyn's hand as the foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas McClendon, guilty on all counts." The breath left Clayton's lungs. Evelyn covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Marin reached over, wrapping them both in her arms as the room erupted, some in relief, others in disbelief. McClendon didn't flinch. He just stood there, jaw tight, eyes unreadable, as the judge announced he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. And then, just like that, it was over. The press swarmed. Reporters asked questions Evelyn didn't want to answer. Strangers sent letters, some kind, some cruel. There were people who still said she made it up, that she did it for attention, that she'd been a troubled child from the start. But Clayton didn't care, because for the first time in 10 years, he could sleep without waking up screaming. The farm was quiet again. Still, Evelyn took walks by herself now. Long walks through the woods, up into the hills. Sometimes she came back with wildflowers. Sometimes she came back with nothing. But she always came back. Clayton rebuilt the old paddock, repainted the barn. He stopped carrying his gun to the mailbox. They were still learning how to live again, but they were doing it together. And one evening, as the sun set low behind the mountains, Evelyn stood beside the pasture fence, watching the horses graze. Her face was peaceful, but her eyes were strong. Clayton joined her, arms folded across the fence post. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think so." He looked at her profile, at the girl who had once been his baby, now a woman who had survived something no one should have to. "I'm proud of you," he said. She turned to him, eyes shining. "I'm proud of you too." They stood in silence for a long while, side by side. And for the first time in years, the quiet felt like home. Winter melted slow that year, as if even the land needed time to recover. Snow slid off the rooftops in long, tired sighs. The trees, once black and brittle with cold, began to bud again. In the mornings, the sun warmed the porch enough for Evelyn to sit outside with her knees tucked to her chest, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watch the light change everything it touched. She no longer flinched at every sound. She didn't check every window before bed. The nightmares still came, but not every night, and when they did, she had someone to hold her hand through the worst of it. Marin stayed on for weeks after the trial, sleeping in the guest room, helping with chores, quietly putting the broken pieces back where they belonged. She never asked for thanks. She just stayed. That, more than anything, made Evelyn believe she was worthy of love again. Clayton had changed too. The man who once kept his grief locked up behind silence had begun to talk. Not much, but enough. He let Evelyn see the ache he'd carried all those years, not out of guilt, but because he wanted her to know she hadn't been the only one trapped in the dark. Sometimes they sat on the porch in the evening, not saying a word, just sharing the quiet. He'd tap her foot with his boot, and she'd smile without looking at him. That was enough. One day, Evelyn found him in the old attic, sorting through boxes of her childhood. He had kept everything: drawings, broken toys, old boots she'd outgrown by 6. When he noticed her in the doorway, he cleared his throat, suddenly unsure. "I thought maybe you'd want some of this back," he said. She stepped forward slowly, picking up a little cloth horse with button eyes. The stitching was frayed. It smelled like dust and memory. "I remember this," she whispered. "I used to carry it everywhere." Clayton nodded. He called her Hazel. A long pause hung between them. "You really kept all of it?" she asked. His eyes met hers, soft and steady. "Couldn't let it go. Felt like if I held on, maybe you'd come back." Evelyn's throat tightened. She clutched the toy to her chest. Then, for the first time since she'd returned, she hugged her father without needing him to make the first move. He didn't cry, but his arms held her like he'd been waiting a decade for it. Later that week, they went into town together for the first time. Heads turned, but no one said a word. Clayton kept a hand on her back, not protectively, just steady. She walked tall, even as whispers chased her down the sidewalk. She wasn't hiding anymore. Evelyn Rourke had survived hell, and she wasn't ashamed of who she'd become. Marin drove back out a few days later with her brother's old truck. She parked beside the barn and handed Evelyn a small bag. "I was cleaning out my attic," she said. "Found something you might like." Inside the bag was a faded journal, Evelyn's. The one she'd kept as a little girl, the one her mother used to write messages in when she couldn't find the words aloud. Somehow, it had survived in a trunk at Marin's family ranch, buried beneath books and dried flower bundles. Evelyn ran her fingers over the cover. Inside were drawings, silly poems, a note from Helen that simply read, "You are braver than you know, my star." She pressed the page to her lips and closed her eyes. "I wish you were here," she said quietly. Marin wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Maybe she is. That spring, they planted a row of wildflowers at the edge of the pasture: lupin, paintbrush, sunflowers, and sage. Evelyn picked each one herself. It wasn't a grave, not exactly, but it was a place where she could sit and remember. A place for Helen, for the lost years, for everything they had come through. On the first truly warm day of the season, Evelyn saddled one of the younger horses and rode out past the ridge where the sky opened wide. She had a letter in her pocket, one she'd written but never sent, addressed to herself 10 years ago, a girl who believed no one would come for her. She read it aloud on the hilltop, voice shaking but clear. Then she tore it in half and let the wind take the pieces. Back at the house, Clayton was fixing a loose board on the porch. He looked up as she returned, his eyes squinting against the sun. "You went out riding?" he asked. She nodded. "Felt good." "Yeah," he said with a smile. "Looks like it did." That night, they ate dinner outside, just the two of them. The stars came out slow. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, legs stretched out, her plate empty and her heart full in a way she didn't quite have words for yet. There were still things to heal. There always would be, but she was no longer defined by what had been done to her. She was here, alive, home, and this time she wasn't leaving.